right, well, thank you all for coming and listening to my presentation on my meta-analysis for evaluating existing control methods for Ventenata dubia. So grasslands, overview. So briefly, I'm going to be doing just an introduction, and that's going to include integrated pest management, the characteristics and life history, and the range of Ventenata dubia, as well as I'm going to take the objectives of my meta-analysis, the methods, the results and discussion, as well as the recommendations I had. So grasslands take up less than 1% of our ecosystems in BC and provide habitat for approximately 30% of our BC species at risk. They help mitigate erosion, filtrate water, sequester carbon, as well as are places full of recreation and have cultural significance to many First Nations community. These grasslands, though, face many pressures, and this can cause the degradation, everything from encroachment of forests and towns to climate change and invasive species. Today, I'm going to be looking at an invasive species called Ventenata dubia, and it's a relatively new invader in BC. I'm going to highlight this species in hopes to further protect our grasslands. Before I really delve into Ventenata dubia, though, I'm going to quickly go over what integrated pest management is, as that was the focus and the lens that I viewed my meta-analysis through. So integrated pest management is a holistic approach for managing pest species on a landscape. There's typically about 6 different steps we use when we're making pest management plans. And these steps include IDing the plant, talking about the, looking at the life history and biology of the species. We then monitor the species and where it's found on the landscape. We then follow up with creating an action plan or an action threshold, and then applying treatment methods and following up with the treatment methods and seeing how effective they actually were. So for my meta-analysis, I mostly focused on treatment methods, and these fall into 4 different categories: mechanical, physical, cultural, biological, and chemical. The mechanical physical treatment method uses by removing part or all of the invasive species from the site. The cultural treatment method looks at decreasing the invasive species by making the conditions for it less desirable. Biological treatment methods look at introducing a pathogen or a predator species for the invasive species. And chemical treatment methods use chemicals that are toxic to the invasive species to suppress the population. So next I'm going to be covering the characteristics and life history of Ventenata dubia. So Ventenata dubia is a winter annual from the Poaceae family. It grows an average of 15 to 46 centimeters tall and has a stalk that's quite stiff and wiry that looks smooth from a distance, but when magnified, it actually has thin hairs on it. The inflorescences are open and drooping with pyramid-shaped panicles, and the spikelets have about 3 to 4 florets each with long, bent, or twisted awns. These awns are really important for dispersal as they catch on clothing, fur, and other machines. Once they've dispersed, they will begin to unwind, and in doing so, they'll actually drive the seed into the soil. The depth of this seed will actually help determine the viability percent within that first year. Typically, though, the seeds are viable between 1 and 3 years, and the first year has about an 85% viability rate, and it sharply decreases after that, and by year 4, there will be a 0% viability of this plant. Before we can have germination, though, there will need to be a breaking of dormancy. This is done through 33 to 94 days of temperatures between 8.6 to 29 degrees Celsius. Germination will most likely occur, or will mostly occur in fall. It will then overwinter in that vegetative state, and by mid-May, the transition phase of growth will begin. By early summer, reproductive stages have started occurring, and by midsummer, full maturation of this plant should be occurring. Next, I'm going to be talking about the range of Ventenata dubia. As seen in this picture, Ventenata dubia is found throughout the Pacific Northwest and in some places in the East. It lives in areas that are 10 to 1,800 meters above sea level and have precipitation ranges of 350 to 600 millimeters per year. It prefers sites, though, that are have lots of spring moisture, and are west-facing slopes with no more than a 50% grade. These parameters, sadly, include many of our grassland ecosystems in BC, including the bunchgrass zone, as well as the ponderosa pine savannas and many of our agricultural lands. Next, I'm going to outline the objectives I have and had for my meta-analysis. It really came down to two. One was the current control methods for Ventenata dubia and how effective were they. The second was the recommendations I had on managing this new invader in BC. So I then went and I looked through search engines referencing things that pertain to Ventenata dubia and found about 74 different papers, which I read, and only 9 of them I actually was able to use in this meta-analysis. I then took these papers and looked at them through an integrated pest management lens, pulling out the treatment methods and ranked them qualitatively for effectiveness. The effective rankings, I had 5 different effective rankings. They were ranked as non-effective, poor, effective, very effective, and proposed. So the not effective ranking meant that there was no change or an increase in Ventenata dubia cover within that year, the not effective ranking meant that there was no change or an increase in density, cover, and or frequency from the control group. The poor ranking had a small decrease in density, cover, and or frequency, but the ability to implement the treatment method was very small. Sorry, could we go back one? Thank you. I'm sorry. The effective treatment methods showed a decrease in density, cover, and frequency, but this may be either a standalone treatment or used as a greater pest management plan. A very effective treatment method was ranked as something that had significant decrease in density, cover, and frequency, but it can controlled in more than 2/3 of the trials that were tested. It also could be a single season or multi-season control. And then I also had a proposed field, though this was more for the biological control, which we will talk about once we get there. Moving into the results and discussion of this presentation, I plan on addressing each of the treatment methods, the mechanical, physical, the cultural, biological, and chemical, each separately, and then look at each of those treatments within that category and rank their effectiveness. So for mechanical physical treatment methods, both the rotary and the sickle mowing were deemed to be not effective. These actually, when applied, showed an increase in cover of Ventenata dubia. The hand pulling, though, was ranked as poor. Though we did see a decrease in cover, this was mostly due to the fact that it's really limiting on how much of this we could actually do. It needed to be very consistent every year, as well as it was not feasible on a larger scale. So it was really limited to very small infestations. So next I talked about the cultural treatment methods. And in these, we look to reduce the conditions and making it less desirable for Ventenata dubia to be on these sites. So the water, the fire, and the grazing treatment methods were all deemed to be not effective. The water and fire treatments showed no increase in cover of Ventenata dubia, but it also didn't show a decrease. But grazing, on the other hand, did show an increase in cover of Ventenata dubia when it was applied. This changed a little bit if we did fire and grazing together. They were still not effective, but it didn't show that same increase that grazing alone did. Next, we looked at seeding the, if we could go back one, sorry. Next, we looked at seeding treatments. And this was done with a herbicide application. And what happened here was, when it was applied in a broadcast setting with a herbicide application, there was some decrease in cover seen. The problem with this, though, was that it's quite limited in many of our grassland ecosystems in BC, and the effect it had wasn't really significant in terms of suppressing or decreasing that Ventenata dubia cover. The most promising out of all the cultural control methods were the addition of fertilizers, and it was ranked as effective. So for this fertilizer treatment, what happened was they used phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium fertilizer, and they added, in conjunction with herbicide treatment, of sulfur-sulfuron or flufenisate with menzoburin. Both of these saw significant decreases in Ventenata dubia cover and quite high increases of the perennial grass covers that were found on site. The problem with this, though, is the perennial grass covers were mostly agronomic species, and they didn't really define or outline how it affected the native species on these sites. So we don't actually have a good idea of how that would have worked in conjunction with the native species. So next I'm going to be looking at the biological control methods for Ventenata dubia. Biological controls are the ones that use the pathogens or predators as a way to manage population size for Ventenata. The problem with this, we have no current biological control methods in the works. So I gathered a collection of biological control methods and put forth by other researchers. Tilia Elizabeth, Tilia Fusca, and Septora Ventenata were all proposed in papers as effective control methods. Barley yellow dwarf virus, I deem though is not effective, though it hasn't been done in any trials. Though it's not done in any trials, the virus, when it was not done in any trials, this virus, though not done in any trials, this virus, when on a native grassland where it's from, it has been seen to infect it. The problem is it didn't show a decrease in health or fitness of Ventenata dubia. We also need to be really careful when talking about biological control methods, as even the process to get in is quite long. And Ventenata dubia shares a tribe with many of our other oak grasses, whether they're agriculture or native oak grasses that we do have. So this is going to further limit those controls, and we're going to need to be really careful. So I wouldn't be planning on any biological controls coming out in the near future. The last category of control methods that I'll be addressing is chemical control methods. These by far saw the greatest success rates overall, with glyphosate and picloram being the only ones that were non-effective as treatment methods for Ventenata dubia. So I'm going to be breaking these down into two, short-term control and long-term control. The short-term control methods I classified as only providing single-season control. These include rimsulfuron, flufenisate with menzoburin, sulfur-sulfuron, and imzapatic. Imzapatic was ranked as poor as its results were actually really wide-ranging. Some showed to be really positive results and had a great effect of decreasing Ventenata dubia on the site, whereas others actually showed an increase when imzapatic was applied. Next, the rimsulfuron, flufenisate, and, flufenisate and sulfur-sulfuron all consistently showed decreases in Ventenata dubia cover within one season. These short-term chemical controls were shown to impact native species though, and some of these were sulfur-sulfuron showing injury rates of 4 to 14%, Anthiopium intermedium, imzapatic, sulfur-sulfuron, and flufenisate with menzoburin showed injury rates to Bromus intermatum and Dactyla glomeratus, and Phylum pratensis also saw an injury rate when imzapatic, sulfur-sulfuron, rimsulfuron, and flufenisate with menzoburin were applied. Our long-term control methods only had two main chemicals that were actually used, indaziflam and propolycarbonate sodium. So indaziflam was used both alone and when it was mixed. This was ranked as very effective. It showed no injury rates to any other perennials, and for all of them, it saw a large decrease in the number of Ventenata dubia that were found on site. The propolycarbazone sodium, when used as a treatment, I ranked it as effective. It did have a lower cover and showed lower covers for Ventenata dubia when applied correctly, but that was within a very small 1 week period right after emergence. And it did also show to have injury rates to Bromus intermatus and Glactilla glomerata. So putting this all together, the secondary hope for my project was to create recommendations for management. So therefore, based on the data I collected, I propose that for short-term control methods, we use flufenisate with menzoburin, sulfur sulfuron, or rimsulfuron. Again, each of what you would use would really be determined by what your native species cover are within that area and what the injury rates of those are. And then the long-term control, I would really suggest the indaziflam, either mixed or alone. It showed to have the best outcome overall and also had the lowest or no injury rate for any of our other native species as far as that study could tell. I would also use fertilizer, but I'd be super cautious with it. I would make sure there was no other agronomic species that I didn't want in my area or any other invasive species around, as I think fertilizer could overpower those native species still. I hoped in doing this that I was going to create some recommendations and start building a firm platform for us to move forward with invasive or integrated pest management. And I think I did this, but we still need a lot of continued research, and it will only help and create new innovative solutions that will help further deal with this invader and protect our grasslands going forward. So I would like to thank you all for taking time to listen to my talk today. And I'm just curious if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Hayley. That was great. Just for everybody, I was running the slideshow today because Hayley's on a PowerPoint, or no, she's on an iPad. And so we couldn't get it to work for her to control her own presentation. And so, I was running the presentation today while she was speaking. So we have a first question in already, and anyone feel welcome to just speak up if you want as well. I failed to mention that we have the discussion question period following the presentation, but during the presentation you can write questions into the chat box. We've got 2 questions right now. Our first one from Rachel Whitehouse. Why were you only able to use 9 out of 72 papers?
So the main reason for only being able to use that number of papers was due to the fact that a lot of them weren't actually talking about the control methods. A lot of them were just, hey, this is out here, and then they would skip over it. They mostly focused on other things like brome grasses, or it was talking about a history of grass within a certain area. So that was why my paper choice was so limited, and it's only really come up within the last 10 years or so. So in having that, it was really limited on how much research has actually been done in terms of controlling this invasive species. So a lot of it's quite new, and so that's why I think only that few papers are actually able to be used. I hope that answered your question.
Trish asks, I've missed it, but where does this plant species originate from?
So you didn't miss it. I had a really hard time finding that. I did find that it hinted over in Europe somewhere, possibly. And then it's also said in certain savannas it might have come from in Africa, but I really did have a hard time. And a lot of the other people who I was reading papers on, they also had a hard time saying, this is the region it's from. It's just kind of showed up. And only because of the relative invasiveness within North America is the reason that we're actually trying to find those origins. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you on that one.
We have a question from Karen. Can you talk about the ecology of the grass?
The ecology of the grass. Sorry. In what way are you kind of thinking, more or less? I'm not sure I quite understand. Sorry.
Karen, do you have a mic? I don't think so. We will, when I hear back from Karen, we'll go back to her. But we'll move on to Hayley. She asks, how was it introduced and spread here? Does it appear in seed mixes, and is it being used in gardens and landscaping?
So it was either a seed mix or soil, and it actually came over in shipping when it came in the US. It didn't actually come into Canada. It stayed in the US. I'm pretty sure, if my memory serves me correctly, between 20 or 30 years ago, and it didn't actually start taking off until the last 10. So yes, it was originally in seed mix, and then it just started getting moved around in soil, and it's not known to be a horticultural plant in any of these sites. It's just something that was from contamination. So I hope that answered your question.
Haley also says, very interesting presentation. I forgot to write that out in the beginning.
Thank you.
So Karen's kind of further explained here. She just basically said, what conditions does the grass need to expand its range?
So again, it needs that I think the moisture, that wet spring really lets it take hold in those environments. So between 350 to 600 millimeters of rain, and with the majority of it being in that early springtime, I think from what I was reading, that really is that deciding factor in a lot of these cases. So I hope that answers your question.
I have a question too, Hayley. We're all out of, I have no more questions in the chat now. So again, if anyone wants to speak up, you're more than welcome. So I've heard that this grass is really similar to cheatgrass. What's one of the identifiers that separates it? If you're out in the field and you think you're looking at cheatgrass, how can you tell it's actually not?
I am not 100% sure on that. I can get back to you though. It is something that is probably very good to know, how to be able to tell that difference. But I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
I've been told that it's got a black node, but I just didn't know if maybe there was some other features maybe that that I didn't know about. We've got another comment from Hayley, or another question. How many sites are currently in BC? Is there an early detection rapid response plan for this species?
So there is no early detection rapid response plan that I have been able to find for this species in BC. And there's only one site that I know of that has been recorded. I have looked, or I did look on an IAP as of last, I believe it was May of 2020. And I hadn't seen really any other places that have come up. I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure it's spreading all over a few of our grasslands. We just haven't been able to put boots on the ground and identify it in the same manner.
I know it's, I'm a little familiar with the grass, but I know that it was down in the Kootenays, right?
Yes, it was, yeah. Yes.
Trish asks again, what are the perceived threats of this species? Does it outcompete with any native species taking over entire ranges? basically asking about how aggressive it is.
Yeah, it does show to be quite competitive with other species. It doesn't, from what we've been able to tell, it doesn't secrete anything that reduces, but any kind of disturbed ground in and around our natives, it will take over, and it will just choke out a lot of the native species that we have. It's not uncommon to just, you can find pictures in the US where it's just fields and fields of this stuff, much like we have knapweed now. So it's something we really do have to manage for and watch out for. And especially with that grazing and the machine moving or anything like that, any kind of being able to pick up that seed so easily with that bent twisted on and just move it around is quite impressively good at spreading.
Jasmine asks, did you see any research papers using drones or spectral imagery for detection?
No, there was none actually that used that at all. I think that would be something that would be really interesting to look at and probably should be used. A lot of the research papers were mostly looking either at historically what was on the landscape and what's on there now, or within those 9 that I used, it was mostly treatment methods, and all of them just found a spot that had it in it, or had the invasive species in it, and just treated as is. So there wasn't a lot of how do we detect and how do we prevent out there.
So I've got one last question for you. How's the palatability of it? Do livestock really like it at all, or do they just leave it behind?
They'll leave it behind, and all stages of growth too. So it doesn't matter how old or what stage of growth it is, they will leave it behind. That really stiff, wiry stem, it's shown to actually be able to cut the tongue. So say of cattle, once you get a little bit of a sliver on their tongue, they will definitely not be going back for it. And the awns also sticking in most anything's mouth and can cause festering and infection to occur. So again, not really palatable at all.
All right, well, we're right at 7:30. Maybe I'll do a last call for anyone who's got any questions. But if there's no further questions for the evening, we'll wrap it up. I'll just give it a minute for people to type. Okay. We've got a comment from Jasmine. There's a provincial EDRR plan for Ventenata dubia. If anyone sees this species, please report it using a report a weed app or at your local invasive species committee. Yes. And
thank you.
Talk to any government office and they'll direct you to the right people to be, if you can't find the invasive species program, there's always just call the government office and they'll direct you to any range person. Thank you so much, Hayley, for your presentation. You did amazing with pronouncing those different chemical treatments. I was like, oh man. So thank you everyone for attending tonight. I hope you all have a good evening or rest of your week, and we will catch you next week. Anna Mary is going to be doing a presentation. She's presenting on, I can get it up for you here. My apologies.